Thank you very much, Kemi. Well, first of all, thank you and the rest of the organizational committee for inviting me to moderate this panel. I hope you will enjoy it as much as I did the previous ones. And again, as the others said before me, congratulations on making this Congress possible, in particular with this difficult situation. So in panel number 6, we'll continue talking about this concept of the dialectics, which I basically understand as a way of oppositional thinking, which is capable of holding two contrary ideas together in mind and retain, let's say, the ability to function. An ability which, by the way, it's exactly what the famous writer Francis Scott Fitzgerald claimed as the best way to test a first-rate intelligence. So that's good. We must feel proud of the exercise of intelligence we're trying to carry out here, all of us. So we'll discussing 3 papers in this session. 2 of them, I think, share a clear common cultural and geographical context, which is Japanese architecture. And to a certain point, also, they both put into question a series of traditional binaries, traditional categories of thought. And so they have a similar way of understanding these dialectics, although of course, they are not exactly the same. And they, as I said, they put into question these binaries, but at the same time, they accept that they cannot simply skip binaries. So they use them to structure their analysis, even if it implies accepting ambiguity, contradiction, etc. And the other paper moves to a totally different pair of cultural contexts and hold a more, let's say, sheer radical confrontation between these two objects, two contexts, which does not mean, of course, that the conclusions are less interesting. So we'll be starting with this last paper presented by Martín Callade, I don't know about the pronunciation, sorry. He's an architect from the University of Montevideo in Uruguay. And he has combined, I believe, his professional work in Uruguay and abroad with research projects like linking urbanism, housing, and other issues around the concept of habitat in collaboration with public administrations. So it seems rather clear to me that this concern about the way the city is built, both through physical realities and through symbolic values, has informed his work. More precisely, and I just give a small spoiler, he will show us how the political struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States of America ended up generating two contrary visions of the city along the post-war decades. So let me hand you over to Martín. Whenever you're ready, you can share your screen. And only I need to keep you in mind that you have 15 minutes for the lecture. So I'll just warn you in case you are about to exceed the limit, but so we can assure the time for the debate. So please go ahead. And another thing, sorry, Martin. While Martin is speaking, well, it's said in the chat, but I encourage the public to write down their questions so they don't forget what they want to ask the contributors. And afterwards, we will get back to them during the debate time. So don't be shy, write them in public or directly to me, and I can read them later. So go ahead, Martin, please.
Great. Thanks, Yomar. It's pronounced exactly as you said. Caja, it's perfectly fine. Okay. And thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. My English may be a bit rusty, but I expect it will work just fine. And just a brief consideration, this is part of an ongoing thesis about the neighborhood units in Uruguay, especially in Montevideo. So it's part of a broader research program, and this is kind of a chapter comparing probably the greatest models regarding this specific study object. So I wanted to, are you still seeing my PDF? Yeah. Great. I wanted to start with kind of a quote from Fukuyama, who declared the end of history as soon as the Soviet regime imploded. And somehow he was certifying the death of the geopolitical duality of the 20th century regarding capitalism and socialism. And this struggle had its most important, I think, spheres regarding the military and the aerospatial race. But somehow the urban product of this duality, which is the title of this paper, maybe a bit silent, but still significant in the struggle, in the ideological struggle of both of them. So I'm going to compare in the next minutes the neighborhood unit as the housing for a machine age, as Perry stated back in the 20s, and what Nikita Khrushchev somehow proposed in the mid-centuries, talking about this apartment for the proletariat, taking some instructions regarding like prefabricated buildings and micro-Ryan as kind of an interpretation of the neighborhood units, but distinctive in its overall model. So the first image is kind of a cartographic expression of this duality and the geopolitical battle that was ongoing during especially the Cold War years, the second half of the 20th century. And it's more of a metaphor of a maybe bigger struggle, trying to push some human and national development strategies. And this may be kind of a simplification, but it was nice to see what the confrontation was regarding the overall globe. And as I was saying previously, the industries that had major impact were probably the armamentistic and the aerospatial, but there were also major improvements in many areas of the daily life, like electrical appliances, consumer goods, and even housing solutions that stated like a basis for these two urban models to proliferate and kind of differentiate the outcome related to the ideological basis. So this is probably the kind of the I don't know, like the emblematic image of the suburban America, and this is Levittown, and it kind of it's probably seen as this byproduct of modernity, but I think the best way to look at it was, or is it to understand it as kind of the core engine of the modernization development regarding the spatial production and the overall metropolitan expansion of the city. So to see the metropolitan expansion this way, it's kind of seeing it as the most important revolution of our time regarding the production of space and probably of material goods associated with them. And this is kind of the opposed image, probably the outcome of the Soviet side of the metropolitan expansion would be these kind of scattered blocks that I used in the paper, kind of two indicators to prove how this was conducted in a way, both in the US and the USSR, through the rural flight on one side, probably like inspecting some numbers. For instance, in the Soviet side, from 1939 to 1989, there was a plus of about 40% of people that were living in the countryside and moved to the city back then. And even though the US had its half of the population approximately already by 1940 living in the city, there was an increase in almost 20%, which were really significant numbers in the overall panorama of those years. And then the demographic growth, the overall population growth, that was for the US was an increase in 100 million inhabitants for during the 4 decades we just mentioned, and for the USSR was mostly the same, 110 between 1945 and 1989. So this kind of demographic background supports and orients the scale of the production that the city has was experiencing in a way. And then I wanted to jump to some specific case studies that have obviously contemporary images studying them, but are probably like role models or exemplary cases for both of the cases I explained a while ago, this housing for machine age regarding the neighborhood unit, and the micro-Ryan for the Soviet counterpart. This is Maryvale in Phoenix in Arizona, and it's with a satellite image we can grasp and perfectly detect the principles Clarence Perry was already boasting and trying to deliver in the 1920s. These principles had like specific urban design axioms and criteria to orient them, and the overall principle regarding the neighborhood unit was the primary school as the aspect that oriented the scale of the urban piece, both demographically and geometrically in a way. This walking distance of 400 meters from the school made possible this kind of circumscribed arterial streets you can see over there, with the corners associated with the shopping malls. This urban layout, this organic urban layout, to somehow made it not so easy to cross the neighborhood unit if not through those arteries, and some other aspects that end up with this global image that is repeated basically all over the United States, and especially from the Second World War onwards to somehow build the American suburbia as we know it, with these basic principles that were established like in the second decade of the 20th century. And this is probably the iconic image, like the isolated house in one of these organic spaces, a small street with a blooming neighborhood life that is also depicted in many cultural products. And on the other hand, we have the Rusanivka in Kiev in Ukraine, which was a former Soviet Union territory. And even though they share some principles with the neighborhood unit, the micro-Ryan is significantly different in the overall aspect and the spatial construction of the built form. But we have to obviously state that the tradition, and especially some of the data that oriented this construction, had to do and had many things in common with the Soviet avant-garde era, like constructivist and previous pre-war thinkers that were also very much influenced by the modern movement. We probably have to mention some great buildings like Nikolaev's and Don Comuna's experiment, but on the modern side of the production of the Soviet history. And it's important to mention that the specific point in history where this model crystallized and had the outcome we see from 1950 onwards had very much to do with Nikita Khrushchev's speech for it's called the Industrialist Building Speech, that he addressed in 1954, that almost promised like a whole enterprise regarding the prefabrication of building units, and started like a very strong race towards this prefabricated model associated with the microrayon and this urban construction. Probably the specific point that must be addressed is the competition that took place between 1956 and 58, that was conducted by Nathan Osterman in Cheryomushkis. It's a spot like the center of Moscow, where the K7, this iconic Soviet building, was designed and won the competition, and then was kind of the mark, or the building mark, that started being repeated in all these urban layouts that were designed in the Moscow plan previously, like in 1934. So we have, on the one hand, the typological artifact that won the competition, and the other hand, this reinterpretation of the neighborhood unit through the Moscow plan, and this combination somehow stated the basis for the proliferation of the microrayon through the second half of the 20th century. This is kind of probably one of the I don't know, generic views you can have on a microrayon street. And just to finish, I have only a couple minutes left. This kind of duality in some aspects, dissecting these urban projects to see how the kind of the basis that the neighborhood unit stated in the 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, went through two different paths, one on the capitalist suburban America, and the other one on the socialist Soviet and collective expression of the unit. So regarding sizes and limits, obviously they are super different in many aspects, but especially the density, the overall density of both of them. One is around the 40 inhabitants per hectare, and the other one is 400. So you have to multiply by 10, and the footprint is usually half. So size and limits are one of the categories to analyze this. The urban fabric is obviously another one, with scattered small blocks in detached houses, and on the other hand, like this bigger slabs, like 5-story slabs, perfectly oriented in the ground. Mobility model, on the one hand, has a private vehicle as part of it, and the other one, public transport, is mainly the means of transport use. Property and land subdivision obviously present like a huge contrast between what one model does and the other. Architectural topologies, we mentioned that. And construction techniques, one of a very centralized, prefabricated way of orienting the industry, and the other one, even though it has some aspects that could be considered prefabricated, and some experiments were ongoing at that time also, it has like a self-produced way to go about the construction. The educational buildings share a common background, and there's no such difference in the overall basis, but the public and leisure space clearly differentiates one another when we have like a fenced oriented environment in the American counterpart, and then more open and green, almost bucolic in some aspects, way of treating the public space in the other. Here, just some numbers. I presented and addressed in the papers to compare both models and show the radical aspects of both of them just by the quantitative aspect. And I think I'm almost done. So just to share.
We're almost kind of running out of time, so don't worry, but please go.
No, it's just a couple of sentences to mention that I think one of the things we can do once we have some historical perspective is to analyze the outcome associated with this way of seeing the urban production as an engine for the modern development of each nation or maybe ideological sphere, and probably the success of the suburban model and this kind of decentralized self-built environment has also data to support that there was a better development quantitatively in both number of housing produced, but also square meters produced. When you compare to the Soviet one, that is now being discussed in Moscow to even tear down some of the Khrushchev experiences. So I may reserve this part for a possible debate later, but I think it's interesting to compare the outcome of both models, and I leave it here. Thanks.
Thank you, Martin. Actually, we'll come back to the debate because I might have a question for that. So that's great. You keep it there. Let's move on to the next intervention by Silvana Castro Nicoli from the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro. Silvana is not only an architect, but also holds a PhD in social history of culture by the same university. So when she talks about the concept of reversed mimesis in Toyo Ito's architecture, you will see how she combines a strict architectural analysis with issues that have to do with this social culture, philosophy, and other concepts that expand the traditional scope of our discipline. So please go ahead, Silvana, whenever you're ready. You need to get the audio because we don't listen to you. We can't hear you.
How I would like to share all the how do I share all the view? Are you seeing everything?
Yes, well, we should do slides on the miniature slides, so you should go onto the slide mode, presentation mode, which I guess.
Okay. You share no. You're sharing. Well, how do I share all the
Silvana, there's an
here.
icon.
Okay, I saw here.
There. Yeah, thank you.
As usual. Here? Okay.
Yes, there you are.
I'm going to read. Good afternoon. Thank you all. Thank you for the invitation. My paper was entitled Nature and Invested Mimesis and Toyo Ito's Architecture. My proposal there was the comparison of two works of architect Toyo Ito, Sendai Mediatek of the year 2000 in Japan and Taichung National Theater of 2016 in Taiwan. As we can observe, there is a change from Sendai to Taichung in the treatment of materiality towards the opacity and strength of concrete walls. Through the concepts of empathy and abstraction proposed by Wilhelm Bochinger, I seek to interpret the meaning of the return to nature in Ito's work and its related urge towards empathy, involved and mimetic apprehension. Sendai was a high point of Ito's research on glass walls transparency, light materials, and modern abstract grid review. Here in Sendai, tree-like tubes structure becomes transparent and dematerialized, and concurrently colossal transposing all floor plates and erupting till the roof. Ito was not interested in literal transparency or modern rationality, but in blurring elements of modern architecture to create spatial ambiguity and indeterminacy. He has been developing spatial ambiguities as a device to open architecture to users' appropriation. Ito's research on architectural transparency is linked to Colin Hall's concept of literal and phenomenal transparency. The last one was associated with topological space and interpretation of inside and outside spaces. Literal transparency was linked to Euclidean and perspectivist space. We can observe that the change of materiality did not mean abandoning search for phenomenal transparency in Taichung. It appears through continuity of public paths of the park and the surrounding through the building in the form of concrete catenoid tubes that penetrates it and spreads along the garden roof. The outer and inner spaces and surfaces penetrate mutually. Have reference to organic forms of nature and phenomenological transparency in architecture of Sendai and Taichung give space a sense of place that can be experienced by users corporally. Ito's intention was to inject organic form materiality to architecture. Ito associates Taichung catenoid tubes to abject nature of digestive tubes and worms. This return to nature, however, does not mean return to imitation mimesis, nor abandoning modern form research. The imitation mimesis presuppose the opposition of the clear, rational, and stable geometric order of architecture to the cause of the phenomenal world, according to an image of nature ordered by the static model of the Platonic world of forms. Ito does not propose taking the static ideal of nature as a reference, but a return to its fluid order that takes as model its process of change, the geometric that serves as the order principle of the ethos mimics the world according to the logical complexity of fractals. The technology of computers also makes it possible to treat the calculation of each structural element in an autonomous way in order to consider a non-homogeneous variation, deformations, and geometric variety in addition to topological operations allows the analogy to be biodiversity of the natural world. Algorithmic simulations allow breaking the traditional hierarchical order between design and structural calculation, and between spatial components that become ambiguous. Internal walls become facades and function structurally simultaneously. This turns to nature through algorithms I called reversed mimesis. Ito's reversed mimesis supposed an understanding of the idea of nature as image and the acceptance of its ambiguity as icon and simulacra. As it is well known, mimesis was condemned by Platonists for its misleading character, the impossibility of distinguishing the copy from the true and real being. For Platonists, nature is considered an image, and the artists, producers of the images of the world of forms. The artist's image is either iconic, when it faithfully repeats the ideal geometric proportions, or is a producer of simulacra, when it's only a partial reproduction of the real world of forms. The philosophical problem of the image, therefore, lies in the recognition of the ambiguous status of the image. The deformed image shows the similarity with what it is not, form. Ito recognizes the ambiguous status of image as truth and simulacrum, as well as its widespread presence in the reality of the information society. Ito works the image as a banal element of the consumer society and as an idea of image. It is at this critical threshold that he seeks to overcome the various dimensions of dualism that encircle contemporary man in his condition as alienated from life. It is important to recall Ito's criticism of utopian visionary architects who intended to replace reality with a dream, and also to destructive architects who turns its back on the city and create miniature utopias. How do I move the next one?
You should just directly click on the screen or use your arrows.
Okay.
Oh.
The search for ontological meaning of inhabiting resulted in an introverted architecture of White U project as an inverted cone iconic form of the house that was then interpreted as a symbolic of the void. The impasse between reality and utopia resulted in such underground cave-like house that reflected contradiction between relativity of everyday life and search for meaning in the closed universe of the house. After the recognition of White U's hermeticism brought by the contrast between its closed form and the ephemeral city, Ito became interested in developing ways for relinking architecture to the city and recovering social context through the recovering of symbolisms that could be collectively appropriated. To encourage collective appropriation, Ito proposed the development of an instrument based on what he called the strategy of ambiguity. Such strategy aims to destabilize the usual and homogenized sense of references of contemporary reality and open space for the spirits of inhabiting. It allows transposing the abstract hermeticism of modern, which is restricted to the individual contemplative experience through iconic references that are subject to collective appropriation. Figurative elements are abstract, and those that refer to homogeneity and urban neutralities are metaphorized. Formal elements of architecture, abstract from reality, would constitute morphemes capable of transmitting the meaning of inhabiting as a suspension of the rhythm of the urban life in behalf of the rhythm of the composition of space. Morphemes are memories and sensations of the bodily experience of the city. Neither the city nor nature serves as model of the house, but provide the symbols of Ito's urban semiotics. Ito's semiotics approach is not contrary to the phenomenological one. It subverts both the sense of mimetic and the abstract approach. The emphasis is on architecture elements that refer to the moment of experience of transition between the world of profane relativity and the world of universal forms. The architecture elements are treated under the edges of phenomenal and non-literal ambiguity, borrowing the terminology of Colin Hall. Ito proposed a further interpretation of spatial ambiguity through creation of discrepancies between architecture elements, surface, space, and structure by semiotic and phenomenological approach. So in Sendai, the mixing of residual city and digital media's iconographies like transient and accidental qualities of light with abstract, modern structural grid and homogeneous space elements activates space. And in Taichung, the cut catenoids turns into calligraphic expression on the glass and concrete facade planes. Taichung is both a neutral glass box and the expressionist structural shape of concrete that leaks out of the building. It is simultaneously the decorated shed and duck. The emergent duck, therefore, means neither returning to heroic architecture nor refusing technology. It means return to a cosmological sense of nature that includes integration of human corporeal to the flows of technological and organic, with no distinction from inside and outside. Now we are going to the Voring pair to analyze the question, the binary proposal of abstraction and mimesis. For Voring, mimesis and abstraction correspond to the reflection of two different psychic states of man in relation to the real. The urge to empathy implied in artistic mimesis reflect the state of harmony between man and the world. It resulted from a relationship of self-confidence that man has developed through the knowledge. The naturalism valued in Western artistic tradition is related to the urge to empathy. It was only through the urge to empathy that reality came to be represented as nature. The natural qualities attributed to object are nothing more than self-projection of organic, psychic, bodily activities. Mimesis would therefore be associated with appeasement through the idealized image. Vorgen opposed...
Silvana, only just, sorry to cut you, but you have like less than a minute left, so in case you can go a little bit more.
I'm going to the last picture. I try to go faster. The urge to abstraction reflects the anguish of primitive man facing the unknown world. For this man, the psychic need for inner activation depended on removing the object from the course of life's event and approximate it to the absolute value of geometric and crystalline forms of inorganic world. Contrary to common sense, Vorige points out the urge to abstraction in architecture corresponds to the strongest expression of material and tectonic qualities. In empathy, such qualities are subject to a will to form informed by feeling for organic. Empathy involved in Sendai does not reflect narcissistic self-projection of man reality. Ito's concern about appropriation is not related to individual subjective experience, but to a collective symbolic one. Sendai represented a high point and a turning point in Ito's process of architectural conception. Ito's return to nature in Sendai supposed a not self-centered conception of subject, as described by Riken Yamamoto, that blurs the notion of interiority and exteriority through the relation to the other. Sendai reflected a change on Ito's intellectual process of conception as individual, since the project included participation of community and by this way was open to interferences of external factors. His changing self would be part of the process of architecture. Quote, what Ito discovered in the process of realization was not a way of giving precedence to external factors that distort the purity of space or formalism that abandoned any effort at opening up the space to the outside, or a cynicism that allows him to pretend that he alone stands on the outside, but a way of transforming his own purity into an actual being, end quote. Although Taichung did not include community participation in the process of conception, its strong materiality of concrete exposed the long and hard labor of the workers in the process of realization, which we can attest in the photos that follows the publication of the finished work. So Taichung also reflects the consideration of open process of architecture that includes architect, society, and environment. At the beginning of the 20th century, vanguard's movement questioned the narcissistic mimetic representation apparatus and retook the Wagnerian diet for its debate. Bataille associated the impulse to return to inorganic nature in abstraction with the death drive. Surrealist artists were involved in a mimesis of the regression that aimed to challenge the established symbolic and cultural order. Primitivism and infantile regressions were ways of resuming death drive relegated by Western culture. The containment of the death instinct allowed for social structuring and the process that triggered the affirmation of the individual as distinct from nature and the group. Art, eroticism, and religion reflect the nostalgia for a violent initial instinct that returns man to nature. The naturalism of the mimetic arts express the distance of primitive violence and the spread of rational order. The established cultural order silences violence that continues to spread. Modern man conceives the world according to the narcissist mimetic reason. Adorno described this mimesis of the modern subject as false mimesis that purged from reality the qualities considered abject for civilization. For him, true mimesis returned man to abject nature. In false mimesis, materiality of substances is excreted as a residue of the civilization process. This attempt to dominate the world by purging what does not fit in mimetic narcissism also acts on interpersonal relationships, where the subject recognizes in the other those vital qualities of their own organic material nature and rejects it as the rest of his own animality. Quote, what repels your strangeness is in fact too familiar. Das unheimlich. They are contagious gestures of direct contacts repressed by civilization, touching, snuggling, placating, inducing, end quote. The house lost its symbolic centrality. If the city configured according to the logic of market equivalence appears on the edges of homogenization and alienation, then the city of the digital age experienced as a reality neutralized by the excess of images. The torpor caused by the images would lead to a loss of bodily senses on behalf of the experience of the city as an abstract phenomenon that determines a disincarnated pleasure. Taichung offers a different proposition from this more abstract approach of 19th. Ito intends to reinforce the experience of the real, of the corporeal, and architecture matter. Such real seems to return as abject, as something that was relegated towards the ideal of abstraction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Silvana. So we're going to proceed to the last paper, which was written by two authors, Sergio Motomura and Robert Duarte, but I believe only Sergio is here to talk about the paper. Sergio has worked in Japan for a long time, correct me if I'm wrong, and now is a PhD candidate at the State University of Londrina. So he'll be talking about the architecture of Sanaa, and more precisely about their capacity of breaking down traditional spatial hierarchies. So we're still talking about very similar topics. So please go ahead, Sergio. We cannot hear you. I don't know if you're speaking. No, you have to unmute you need to.
Okay.
There you are.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good afternoon. I will present, sorry. The screen, this is not the first screen.
Maybe use
How can I go?
The arrows on the computer, on the keyboard. or no?
Yeah.
No?
No. No forward, no back. Can you help me?
If you click once and then use the arrows, sometimes it works, and then go back on the.
Okay.
There you
go. Good afternoon. I will present the paper, the composition of hierarchical system, dualities in Sana's architecture, written with Professor Juvenil Duarte. First, we'd like to thank the organization of Critical International Conference for this great opportunity. Our research proposed to approach binary structures from the perspective of spatial hierarchy in Sana's architectural production between 1990 and 2010. The motivation for this study came from the words of the architect Yuri Nishizawa in an interview, which highlights his and Sejima's interest in exploring other possibilities, other ways, other types of relations, in short, inventing new hierarchies. Spatial hierarchy was already pointed out as a key point to understand the complexity of Sana's architecture. It would even be possible to signalize the existence of a concern on the part of the critics in relation to a destabilization of an existing spatial hierarchy. The critics, they use terms such as hierarchy has disappeared, the construction of hierarchies, abolition of hierarchies, and even consider a liberation of spatial hierarchy by a creation of a non-hierarchical structure. But Nishizawa affirmed that they are not interested in creating a non-hierarchy, but making a new one, which is different from the existing hierarchy. So we draw attention to an idea of producing a new spatial hierarchy through the failing of a previous hierarchy, the existing conventional Western European hierarchy, by means of equivalences and equalities, probably influenced by the Japanese culture. We suggest that a line of Sana's architectural creation transits between poles of a binary system that produces complexity. And the Japanese cultural aesthetic is certainly an important key in the understanding of how Sana experiments hierarchical compositions, but with influences from the Japanese culture. In many moments, Sejima and Nishizawa deny any references in their projects. Sejima said, generally, we do not refer. We have never quoted, said Nishizawa. But the architects cannot avoid extracting some influences from Japanese tradition. And as they said afterwards, this is not an option that they can take. Nishizawa then compliments. We are obviously influenced by Japanese culture because we grew up in a Japanese atmosphere. Sejima and Nishizawa claim not to disregard history and tradition. The important point is that they just refuse to accept them as fixed assumptions and preconceived responses. Let's take a quick look at the Japanese culture. According to King, the basic qualities of Japanese aesthetics are suggestion, irregularity, simplicity, and perishability. The Japanese aesthetic sees beauty in the implicity, the unspoken, the vague, in the asymmetry, the imperfection, the incomplete, in the economical and control aesthetic quality of the emptiness, in the impermanence, brevity, and fragility of things, in the possibility of aging. And involving all of this, we can emphasize the concept ma, which is a well-known term in architecture, as a non-static concept, transformation through the overlapping of space-time. The empty, the unspoken, the simple, the regular are intervals of power, possibilities for the action of forces that reconstruct or recode. Professor Nakagawa exemplifies this specificity, so ingrained in the Japanese spirit, in Japanese art, showing us a painting by the artist Saito Mioka, a juxtaposition of several images, the river, the mountains, woods, pavilions, creating a landscape structure that does not represent a real perspective. The Japanese aesthetic is juxtaposition is harmonious, as it emerged from a peaceful coexistence of heterogeneous elements, promoting the enrichment of the whole through the mutual collaboration, an union, never a fusion. We can say that the Japanese aesthetic does not seek an answer. It values uncertainty. Uncertainties where possibilities can emerge. Then, the ambiguity of the Japanese culture underlines the importance of hierarchy as a relevant factor in understanding its architectural complexity, known as architectural complexity, which is marked by the difficult reading of complex juxtapositions of its parts and its values. Certainly, the fading mechanisms of the spatial hierarchy, conscious or not, are influences of the Japanese cultural formation by the architects, working in the interval between pairs in a binary system, deconstructing and recoding spatial dichotomies. We went to the literature about spatial hierarchy, and we observed that even recent studies on the subject are based on research by these authors, Schenck, Clark, and Pause and Owen, who have dedicated to formal analysis in architecture. Schenck classified the hierarchy based on three differences: size, shape, and placement. For Clark and Pause, not only physical, formal, and geometric changes determine a spatial hierarchy, but other attributes such as simple, complex, public-private, sacred, profane, servant, individual, and group. Owen, in turn, introduces to the discussion about hierarchy the idea that experiencing architecture involves movement. Transition, hierarchy, hurt is one of his spatial organization themes. How to read these juxtapositions and architectural complexities regarding to spatial hierarchy? For realizing the absence of new and important discussions in our architecture field, we seek discussions in areas outside architecture, and we seek support in Herbert Simon's hierarchy theory. Interdisciplinary theory emerged in the 60s as an alternative approach to simplify the description and thus improve the comprehensibility of complexity. Complexity frequently takes the form of hierarchy, and hierarchy refers to the multiple levels that provide several possibilities for structuring a complex system. In hierarchy theory, the search for the simplification of complexity takes advantage of the fundamental property of complex systems, which is the near decomposability, a mechanism for understanding a complex system by understanding its primary and individual parts. In other words, the hierarchy theory deals with relationships that the smallest parts have with each other. So the complexity of Sana's architecture can be apprehended applying the near decomposability mechanism by analyzing its simplest structures, the binary pairs, spatial and conceptual dualities. To determine the binary pairs to be analyzed, we cross principles pointed out by Schenck, Clark, and Pause and Owen with characteristics closely linked to spatial hierarchy in Sana's architecture, characteristics revealed by 13 critical texts on Sana's architecture and interviews by Sejime Nishizawa. We define 8 spatial and conceptual dualities that are parts and whole, figure and background, transparency and opacity, grid and axis, exterior and interior, grouping and compartmentalization, public and private, server and server, served and server. Now in this work, the projects we analyzed were selected from the assessment of citations of the theme spatial hierarchy. The 13 critical texts and interviews by Sejime Nishizawa revealed the projects where spatial hierarchy is most discussed in Sana's architecture. The project selects were the Kunstlinie Theater and Cultural Center in Almere, Netherlands, the 21st Century Museum of Contemporary Art in Kanazawa, Japan, the Glass Pavilion at the Toledo Museum of Art in the United States of America, and the Rolex Learning Center, EPFL, in Lausanne, Switzerland. Next, I present briefly the analysis of the dualities, separating the parts of each binary pair by colors, seeking to detect hierarchical connections with a sort of ambiguous relationships. Parts and whole. it is observed the polarization of both the part and the whole, supported by a strong ambiguity. Although the idea of the individualized part is strengthened, the constructive element of the whole is striking and well-defined geometrically. And transparency acts directly in the bounding form of the whole, weakening the accuracy of the enveloped boundary. Figure and background. It is observed the individualization of the figures, but the relationships between the figures serve to value the background as an architectural element to be perceived, not as simple residues to be residues of the figures. Transparency and opacity. It is observed the valorization of transparency in favor of the opacity of figures. Transparency suggests surprises due to the weakening of perception of forms, creating an atmospheric effect. Transparency works as a mechanism of visual distortion and distance manipulation. And sometimes the juxtapositions of transparencies creates an opacity effect, which causes a disconnection between the parts. Grid and axis. It is observed the valorization of asymmetry, supported on a grid that most of times tends to be faded. Some lines of the region grid resist the almost random composition of the parts and are maintained as structural or circulation axis. Symmetry is only in parts. Exterior and interior. It is observed a clear valorization of the interior space, full of riches and surprises, emphasized as an extension of the urban, as an interior part. The facades are not to be appreciated. The idea is to see through them, connecting interior and exterior by transparency. Grouping and compartmentalization. It is observed the valorization of both. Grouping or compartmentalization, both elements seek to individualize the parts, building a homogeneous fabric, which is ambiguous. Public and private. It is observed a clear valorization of the public space. The projects are built to be appropriated to the maximum by the users as in a public park. Authorized and unauthorized spaces are directly derived from the program, but it is possible to notice the fading of relations between the parts caused by their pulverization of the whole. Served and server. It is observed the valorization of the server space. To its manipulation, they try to configure new relations to the served space. The architects eliminate the corridors as much as possible, or connect everything exaggeratedly surrounding everything with a large and continuous circulation space. The fluid and extreme connectivity of its parts allows to hierarchy. To conclude, the analysis suggests a desire by Sejima and Ishizawa to decomposing dichotomies and barriers through juxtapositions without dissolving them. They avoid the most polarized hierarchies, searching to value a dialogue between the opposites. And this comes close to Professor Nakagawa's quotation on Japanese aesthetics, a peaceful coexistence of heterogeneous elements that promote the enrichment of the whole through mutual collaboration, a union, never a fusion. The poles of the binary structures remain present. This complex atmosphere in Sana's architecture blurs an easy reading of a prevalence of one part over another in dualities. Fading is not the erasure of hierarchy, but the production of a more complex one. Certainly, in a very special way, Sana was inventing new hierarchies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergio. That was very inspiring as the previous ones. So it's time to begin our debate. I think we've touched many interesting issues. I don't know, making a small resume. Sergio has used binaries as categories of analysis to understand both, let's say, the organizing principles of a series of buildings and the logics behind the creative process of Sana's work. But at the same time, he tried to treat these binaries in a non-binary way, which it's hard, but it's there. And Silvana has taken an apparently contradictory, ambiguous dual term, let's say that of reversed mimesis, to explain a shift within the work of Toyo Ito, And she has introduced further conceptual pairs like empathy and abstraction, organic, inorganic, etc., to further elaborate on this shift. And Martin has put on the same table two opposed yet equivalent objects, these city models, no, by two antagonistic ideologies, and has dissected them, I think he used that term, through the same analytical parameters. So making this opposition even more evident. So there are three different ways of approaching dualistic thinking, but I think we have obviously many things in common. So I don't know if we have one question from the public, but let me start with one question, a couple of questions I had specific for each of you. So let me start with the last intervention. Maybe it's a specific question, but looking at your drawings, Sergio, I couldn't stop wondering, to what extent is it really possible to represent this breaking down of binary pairs through a series of two-color drawings, in the sense that in the end, they cannot escape their strong binary condition, no? So having in mind, for instance, your figure background schemes, no? I asked myself whether the courtyards, for instance, in Kanazawa Museum or Toledo Museum, couldn't be considered as part of the figure category as the rest of the interior rooms, because instead of part of the circulation and outside space, because somehow, compositionally speaking, they function almost as a figure, not as a neutral background, don't they? So it's an easy example, but I feel like it happens all the time. Like in more general terms, there are many elements that refuse to be colored in just one tone, no? Instead, they are ambiguous, as you said, holding a flickering condition or something like that. So I don't know if you can elaborate on this, Sergio?
Yes, it's very complex, all of the relations of the dualities, and the diagrams that I show, that I made, is maybe we can say that this is a starting point for the analysis, not the result of the analysis, because I use this diagram, these diagrams with the taxes and the critics and with the analysis of spatial analysis with the photographs and experiences myself, and try to understand this complexity, these relations of the binary pairs, and sometimes more than one, 2 or 3 pairs confused, and we don't know what they are trying to. What pair they are trying to valorize sometimes, but that's not a result of the analysis. It's an instrument for the analysis. I think. Yes.
Yeah, for sure. I even elaborating further on this, I think that even the different schemes can be confused between each other. They're almost sometimes even interchangeable, as if there's no clear limit, not only between the terms of the binary, but also between different binary pairs. And that made me think, I don't know if you're familiar with Aldo van Eyck's twin phenomena from the 50s, what this Dutch architect said about, well, if you aren't, I recommend you read them, because he claimed that we should be breaking down traditional hierarchies, basically. And he said that once you're concerned with one of these twin phenomena, you will discover that you're inevitably concerned with all of them, because they form an interwoven network of dualities. So maybe this sort of cascade effect is happening to you as well. So I don't know if maybe that's a good recommendation. We have to continue.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, I really try to read the relations just of the binary pairs, individual, one by one, according to the hierarchy theory, to understand for bottom the complexity of the levels, but always something is coming in, yes. But the proposition was in a second analysis, or I can say, to capture how much these interferences is influenced in the simple structure of the binary pairs. And sometimes you we saw that it's not a choosing A or choosing B or choosing A B to choose a transit space or transit between A and B, but it's more complex. Sometimes they just they are using the both to create something different. That's
Okay.
it's very interesting.
Yes, thank you very much. I can take the chance to ask Silvana, for instance, because obviously there are many things in common between these two papers. So I would like to ask Silvana, also Sergio, if he wants to step in. You both talk about fading traditional hierarchies, about spatial ambiguity, treating certain architectural categories like partitions and structure in an ambiguous way. So to what extent do you see these projects are like two manifestation of really similar concerns? I mean, we know Sejima has worked for Toyo Ito, but at the same time, who's really inspiring who, or is it just something rooted in the Japanese culture, as Sergio just suggested? So maybe Silvana can step in and we can go ahead.
About a Japanese culture, or could you repeat the end? If the
No, I mean, if you think that these like Toyo Ito's and Sana's method of breaking hierarchies or these concerns are just, well, not just, but something rooted in the Japanese culture, as Sergio suggested, or is it something that Toyo Ito started and Sejima took it from her working with him, or what do you think about like common things you find within between them?
I think initially, I think that Ito's research was direct to abstraction, not to historical issues. But recently, he's recovering this historical, mythical Japanese references, like the rituals of Shimbashira and so on, in relation to Sendai, for example. And I think it's important to remember the book from Arata Isozaki, Japaneseness, because he describes there the construction of made by Western modern architecture that construct Japanese architecture as simple, clear, transparent, and that was what's that the modern architects there find what they were looking for. And there are opposite references from traditional Japanese architecture that are not so transparent, light, and that have this fading characteristics, like the architecture from I don't remember now, but with no, I think so.
Okay, no, that was clear enough. I think you made your argument for sure, and I think yes, we'll have one question to Sergio. So don't forget, we won't forget Martina. I have a question for you in the end, but let's just close with this Japanese culture thing. There is a question to Sergio. What are the ethical values related to transparency in Sanaa projects, and how could they relate to Brazilian brutalism and its transparency understood as material honesty? What do you think? Yeah,
well, I'm not a specialist in Brazilian brutalism, but about the transparency of the Sanaas, as I show, the Japanese culture is not looking for an answer, for a real answer. So the material you don't have to look for an honest transparency of the vidro, the glass. The Sana uses glass to reflect, to reflect, to not only to about transparency.
Not only to see through, right?
Yes,
but
yes.
to see through less, let's say.
Sometimes, as I said, just the positions of many layers of glass is opacity.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna pass to Martin, which, and I wanted to ask you what you were saying in the last slide, let's say. What happened to these places? Like, well, both the sprawling cities in the US, of course, but above all, these microregions in the Soviet Union after the fall of the wall. I mean, for instance, the large extensions of public land. Did they survive? Are they well maintained? Do they have the social stigma we have in our modernist neighborhoods all over Europe and America? And also, what happened in terms of narrative, social acceptance, identity values? How are they seen today? You anticipated some things, but you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, sure. I think it's kind of a crucial aspect. In 2019, we had a chance to do a field trip in Russia, in Moscow specifically, with the faculty from Uruguay, and we were told that there's kind of a huge debate regarding the prefabricated slabs from the Soviet era and its conservation in a way, but also how the capitalist context is treating those voids, the green spaces voids that are between blocks, but also the chance of tearing down most of the 50s, 60s, and 70s blocks because of pathologies regarding the prefabricated system. Basically, the balconies are falling apart, and there have some structural problems, and that is kind of an excuse to tear it down. I think in Moscow, the debate was ongoing at the time, but there was like 8,000 slabs in the Moscow periphery about to be torn down. That was kind of a huge impact, but somehow the environment inside the microregions, it's still well preserved in a way. Apart from the pathologies or the structural aspects of some of the elements, I think the neighborhood life is kind of preserved. Some things are fenced. It's not such an open space as it was probably like 30, 40 years ago, but still has a neighborhood life going on that is part of the ideal for both the microregion and the neighborhood unit of this idealistic community going on that I think survives in both cases. And I don't know if it's successful in the overall balance, but at least it's kind of struggling to be considered and surviving in a way.
Okay, thank you very much. I also thought about a reference that might be used for you. I don't know if you know the last exhibition created by Jean-Louis Cohen at the CCA. I think it's 2020 or something, or 2020. It's Americanism in Russian architecture. And it's kind of confronting these two antagonistic visions, but also detecting cross-fertilizations between each other. So it's quite good. I mean, I think, well, most of it's not how the Russian culture didn't see American culture only as a threat, but also kind of a paradoxical inspiration that you also mentioned a little bit in your work. I was also thinking about the American National Exhibition in Moscow in the 1950s. I don't know if you've incorporated in your work all those confrontations between Nixon and Khrushchev, talking about these visions, which I think are quite clear, are the reflection of your work. I don't know if you want to say anything else about it.
No, it's I mean, for me, it's kind of a super inspiring and interesting debate that it's still open in a way. And I think it, especially for maybe for the European context, that it's in a way in the middle of both. It's still a point to reflect on how we construct the neighborhoods. And I don't know, in the pandemic scenario with the 50-minute city and those debates on retracting in a way to a neighborhood lifestyle. I think it has some things to continue this debate on how we produce our cities and our neighborhood, that it's still super interesting.
Okay, and I think we have one question from Marcos. Maybe it could be the last question, so we can close the debate. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Guillermo. First of all, thank all of you for the presentations, which are very inspiring. And Guillermo, the discussion also has been driven into an interesting direction. I think I'm very keen on both examples Sergio and Mario bring, but also Silvana and also Japanese architecture. While I'm seeing your analysis grid, I will call it this way, or your rationale, thinking about the Rolex Learning Center, and having visited it and having recorded this experience of being in that place, it makes me think of Marquise do Ibirapuera, but also watching Martin show the patterns there in the way buildings are settled in the city also makes me think the relevance of those discussions to our continent. I won't say only Brazil, but South America. So my question is whether you can, or you could reason on the applicability of some of the lenses that you propose, the analytical lenses or parameters for these cases, or for the Brazilian or the South American cases.
Is it for anyone in particular?
Yeah, I was going to ask just that to Marcos. I can start, but I think it was for the three of us.
Go ahead.
Yeah, especially the case of Latin American, the Latin American perspective on these models, I think it's also similar to the European counterpart. It's kind of torn between those two worlds. Especially, I'm studying neighborhood units in Uruguay, and we have some things in common with this American sprawling on the periphery, but also we have the Soviet slabs in a way inserted through the prefabricated system. So I think the Latin American scenario, and especially Uruguay, is kind of the mixture of both, and it's especially interesting to look on both sides, and it's almost as a thesis from the antithesis and synthesis regarding the two of the ones I presented today. So I think it's kind of a huge subject, but still super interesting. And yeah.
Anyone else? Sergio?
Okay. Well, yes. Well, if we think in the degree of realness of a hierarchy architecture, we can see that it's not only not depends only the nature of the object, the complex object, but the important is the observer, the user abilities. Then it is possible to replicate in any cultures, comparing any cultures, and exaggeratedly speaking, and each person has his own culture, I think.
I don't know if Marcos, you are happy with those answers.
It's fine. I'm just, I think there's a programmatic thinking behind Sana's work, which you showed very clearly in your presentation, which poses some question to what we call generous architecture in Brazil very often. In the Ibirapuera Marquise, we have several things happening, and what we may call spontaneous programming taking place under the Marquise, with way less interest in this programmation and the ways it intertwines with some very clear logics, no, on the complexity building and so on and so forth. I have the well, my experience in Sana's Rolex Center is that everything was way more defined in a way. There's also a completely different scheme, and it's inserted in a different way in the city. So I think it's an interesting comparison because of the formalistic aspect of both buildings and the way they operate in completely different ways. Just your diagrams bring that up very clearly, I think. So I thought maybe that's something to think about.
I remember that Sejima Nishizawa have an interview, important interview with Oscar Niemeyer, and certainly they influenced very much the architecture of Sanaz after that.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we are already out of time, so I guess we should be ending this session. I thank you all for your presentations, for engaging the debate, and for all the audience. And well, I hope to see you in a while. I don't know if Akemi needs to give some specific instructions.
Yeah, thank you, Guilmar. Thank you very much. And thank you all for this great panel. We're now closing this panel and everyone will be directed to a waiting room. You will be able to return to this same room once the next panel begins in 25 minutes. We invite you all to keep participating in the conference activities, and I hope to see many of you after the break. See you. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you all of you. Bye.